What do you get when you take a 327 block, shove in a 283 crankshaft, and call it a day? Chevy's sneaky 302. Meanwhile, Ford was busy creating their own 302 from scratch, complete with exotic Cleveland heads and forged internals. Two completely different approaches to the same challenge, meeting that strict 305 cubic inch displacement limit that had Detroit scrambling. Chevy's sneaky 302 versus Ford's ground-up monster. Only one would own the road courses. The result was a 3-year war that changed muscle cars forever. But which 302 was really faster, and how did a single rulebook page force Detroit's best engineers into uncharted territory? The story starts with one simple racing regulation that nobody saw coming. The rule that started a war. In 1966, the SCCA Trans Am Series dropped a bombshell that caught Detroit completely off guard. They instituted a strict 35 cubic inch displacement limit for the 1967 season. This wasn't just another racing regulation, it was a direct assault on the big block dominance that Ford and Chevy had been enjoying. The SCCA's 305 cubic inch cap blew up big block dominance and forced Ford and Chevy to rethink small V8 designs completely. The displacement limit was so precise that every cubic inch mattered. Engineers had to get creative with bore and stroke combinations they'd never considered before. The math was simple but brutal. Stay under 305 cubic inches or don't race at all. And thousands of street-legal engines had to exist before a single lap could count. The homologation requirements made things even more complicated. The SCCA didn't just want prototype race engines, they demanded that any engine used in competition had to be available in production cars sold to the public. This meant Ford and Chevy couldn't build pure race motors and forget about street manners. They had to create engines that could pass emissions testing and still dominate on Sunday afternoons. The timeline pressure was absolutely crushing for both engineering teams. They had less than 12 months to design, test, and manufacture completely new engines from the ground up. Ford's team was scrambling to create their 302 with all the high RPM components needed for racing success. Chevy's engineers were frantically trying to figure out how to combine existing parts into something that could compete. The SCCA required a minimum of 1,000 units to be produced for homologation eligibility. This wasn't just a few prototype engines. Both companies had to commit to serious production numbers before they even knew if their designs would work on the track. The financial risk was enormous, and failure would mean complete exclusion from one of America's premier racing series. This rule unleashed the most creative period in small block development that Detroit had ever seen. Engineers were forced to explore every possible advantage within the strict cubic inch limit. Two companies would tackle the exact same mathematical problem in completely opposite ways. Two companies, two completely different solutions. Ford built their 302 from scratch, while Chevy raided their parts bin. Ford's engineering team took the clean sheet approach that would define their racing philosophy for decades. They weren't interested in quick fixes or clever shortcuts. Every component in their 302 was designed specifically for high RPM racing punishment. The block featured 4-bolt main bearing caps, instead of the typical 2-bolt setup. Forged pistons, beefed-up connecting rods, and a forged steel crankshaft replaced their cast counterparts. The real secret weapon was their Cleveland heads, completely different castings with larger intake and exhaust ports, bigger valves, and redesigned combustion chambers. Ford had created a breathing advantage that conventional small block heads simply couldn't match. Chevy's engineers looked at the same displacement problem and saw an opportunity hiding in their existing parts catalog. They grabbed the 4-inch bore from their proven 327 block and married it to the short 3-inch stroke crankshaft from their 283. The math was perfect, exactly 301.6 cubic inches. No new tooling required, no expensive development costs, just smart parts combination that maximized bore size while keeping strokes short for quick revving capability. The larger bore diameter allowed for bigger valves and better breathing than their 283. The short stroke meant less piston speed at high RPM, which translated to more reliable operation when engines were spinning 7,000 RPM on road courses. Ford chose a balanced solid lifter cam for control. Chevy went wild with a race spec grind that hated idle but loved high RPM. Ford's methodical engineering created what was essentially a race car with license plates. Chevy's creative parts combination produced a race car that happened to be disguised as a street machine. Two philosophies, one racetrack. Let's see how they duked it out. The track battles that made history. By 1968, spectators wondered if Chevy had any answer to Ford's engineering dominance. The Boss 302's high RPM capability and bulletproof reliability gave Ford an early advantage that seemed almost unfair. While Chevy's Z28 engines were making impressive power, they couldn't match the consistent performance Ford delivered race after race. The Boss 302 could rev to 7,000 RPM all day long without missing a beat. At Riverside that year, Ford drivers were crossing finish lines, while Chevy teams were still in the pits dealing with mechanical failures. The Ford domination looked unstoppable until Roger Penske and Mark Donohue arrived with a game-changing strategy for Chevy in 1969. Penske brought something Ford hadn't counted on: meticulous preparation that turned Chevy's raw horsepower into championship-winning consistency. Donohue's driving skill overcame Ford's technical edge through pure racecraft and tactical brilliance. They didn't just show up and hope for the best. Every component was blueprinted, every setup was perfect, every pit stop was rehearsed. Their strategic upset at Riverside proved that smart tactics could beat superior engineering when applied correctly. Penske's team had found ways to make the Z28's aggressive nature work in their favor rather than against it. They learned to manage the engine's temperamental idle and harsh cam profile. They discovered suspension setups that maximized the Camaro's natural balance. Ford's engineers watched in frustration as their technically superior Boss 302 lost races to better strategy and preparation. Ford struck back in 1970 with refined Boss 302 development that addressed every weakness Penske had exploited. The updated engine featured improved oiling systems and revised intake manifolds. Ford's suspension engineers had spent the entire off-season studying Penske's setup secrets. The racing team implemented new pit strategies that matched Penske's efficiency. Their dominating performance at Laguna Seca reclaimed the championship for Ford in convincing fashion. After reclaiming the crown in 1970, Ford quietly exited Trans Am, ending the duel at its peak. But the real story wasn't just what happened on the track. Behind the scenes, both companies were playing games with the rulebook that made the racing victories possible. The dirty secrets and factory tricks. Detroit's insurance problem forced both companies into elaborate deception schemes that fooled nobody but satisfied the paperwork. The insurance industry was cracking down hard on high-performance cars in the late 1960s. Both Ford and Chevy faced a simple choice: underrate their engines or watch insurance companies price their customers out of the market. Chevy downplayed 375 horsepower as 290 horsepower. Ford did the same. The numbers were so obviously fake that nobody in the industry took them seriously. What are the odds that two completely different engines would make exactly the same power? Independent dyno tests later revealed the real numbers, but the official rating stayed artificially low to keep insurance rates manageable. Factory race shops developed their own underground networks for special components that bent homologation rules beyond recognition. Mechanics would quietly swap out standard parts for race-spec pieces before cars left the dealership. The practice became so common that serious buyers knew to ask for the special treatment. Two vivid examples show how creative the factories got with their interpretations. Camshafts would be ground to completely different profiles than production specs after official inspections, but before cars reached customers. Ford's Cleveland heads received special porting work that wasn't available on regular production engines, with larger intake and exhaust ports that dramatically improved breathing. These modifications happened in gray areas where everything was legal on paper, while being completely different in practice. Ford's exotic Boss 302 parts were technically available to customers, but practically impossible to obtain. The special Cleveland heads were listed in parts catalogs, but had months-long waiting lists. Forged internal components existed on paper, but rarely made it to dealer parts departments. Ford created a system where everything was legal on paper, while being completely unavailable in practice. These loophole exploitations gave racers real race parts disguised as showroom engines. The regulatory framework simply couldn't keep up with Detroit's innovation. Factory engineers exploited every gray area they could find, creating legendary street performance that made both engines icons among enthusiasts who knew the real story. When the smoke cleared and the tricks were exposed, one question remained about these two radically different approaches. The numbers tell the whole story about these legendary power plants. Ford chose engineering over shortcuts. Precision instruments built for one purpose. Chevy picked parts bin creativity over clean sheet design. Mad scientist combinations that worked better than anyone expected. Ford delivered reliability over raw drama. Chevy brought explosive power over predictable performance. Ford played by the rulebook, while Chevy exploited every loophole they could find. Both approaches created automotive legends that gearheads still argue about today. Tell us your 302 battles in the comments. And let me know which one you'd choose for a modern build. Which approach was truly superior? Ford's methodical engineering or Chevy's creative genius?